Good afternoon and welcome to Harrison Clark Wickerby's Cybersecurity Conference. We're delighted you're able to join us and look forward to your questions and participating throughout the next few days. So my name is Nicola McNeely. I'm a partner and I'm our head of technology sector. I have the privilege of working with some brilliant lawyers and great clients to help businesses survive and flourish day to day. Thank you so much for joining this session. My talk is entitled The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, Getting Your Policies and Contracts Right. So it's not the most exciting topic in the world, is it? But it's highly relevant to board directors and CEOs. So ask the former CEO of Equifax, who was fired in large part for failing to adequately address and provide for cybersecurity risk in his business. Would you believe it affected nearly 150 million customers and cost Equifax over $4 billion US. Uber, for example, also reported hackers stole information of over 57 million riders and drivers in 2016. They actually concealed the breach for over a year and tried to pay off the hackers to delete the stolen data and to keep the breach quiet. So guess what? Cybersecurity is the greatest threat to every company in the world today. And most companies take nearly 6 months to detect a cyber attack or a data breach, even major ones. Businesses of all sizes, locations and industries have been impacted by cybersecurity, and we've seen a very significant rise in cybercrime, particularly over the COVID period. I'll give you some scary statistics now. So 95% of cybercrime is caused by human error, generally through your employees. So malware attacks are very common. So training your employees is absolutely critical. Since COVID-19, there have been a 300% increase in reported cybercrimes. It's going off the scale. Data breaches have exposed 36 billion records by the end of September 2020. It's the worst year for data breaches on record. Most people don't actually know what to do after a data breach or a cyber attack. They're just not prepared. The average cost of a ransomware attack on a business is £250,000. The average downtime due to a ransomware attack is 19 days, but it can be much longer. Are you sure your business would survive that long? Cybersecurity insurance pays ransoms, they say 94% of the time. So 84% of organizations say they've got cybersecurity insurance, but only 64% of policies actually cover ransomware attacks. So that basically means 1 in 5 businesses are unprotected. Are you sure you've got ransomware cover? The average time to detect a breach in 2020 was 207 days. Can you believe that? So systems were left exposed on average for that length of time. And 64% of malware is delivered by email. So the importance of making sure your staff are trained to spot malware attacks is absolutely critical to business survival. You can barely pick up a paper these days without hearing about one cyber attack or another, and what's published in the newspapers is just the tip of the iceberg. Your average SME, which is impacted by a ransomware attack, doesn't make the headlines, but the impact can be devastating and long-lasting for that business, its employees, directors, suppliers, and customers. We see that day to day. So nothing quite prepares you for the news your business has been subject to a cyber attack. I've had a number of calls from directors in this situation, and often they're like a rabbit in the headlights. They don't know what to do. If they had a business continuity and cybersecurity policy, and they'd implemented it and they tested it, they'd be in a much stronger position. But quite often, everything that they've put in place goes out the window because it's not been tested or verified. And it's a very difficult conversation to have with a director in that situation when they're just not prepared. So my one plea to you today is please don't be on the back foot, be prepared, get your ducks in a row and make sure that if you are attacked, that you will come out of it as best as you possibly can. So some of the things your board might be grappling with are issues like, how much should I spend on cybersecurity and insurance? What does everybody else spend? What metrics should I report to my board and my shareholders? How can I quantify my cybersecurity risk? What tools should I use? What should I implement? And how much security do I actually need? Well, there's no magic solution really, and no magic answers to those questions. They don't minimize the risk. All they do is help you focus on the important things, which are your internal audit, regulatory compliance, and preparation. So all I would say to you is cybersecurity readiness is a choice. You can either take that choice or ignore it, and it should be high up on the agenda of risk register issues for you and your company. Create adequate, reasonable, and consistent controls in your business, and make sure that you have effective and credible controls to minimize risk. That's the best you can do. It doesn't mean you won't be attacked, because sod's law you will, but at least if you are, then you'll know you'll be in the best position possible to recover. So what I'm going to do this afternoon, I'm sorry, it's really boring, it's legal stuff, but I'm going to talk you through cybersecurity policies, business continuity and disaster recovery policies, and explain the difference between having a draft policy on paper and actually implementing it real time when you need to. The need to do trial runs and tests and prepare and have your processes in place is absolutely critical. Don't just keep the policies in a desk for doomsday scenario and have to dust off the dust when you do need to implement them. That won't help you. So I guess start with the basics. What's the difference between information security and cybersecurity? Information security is basically about protecting information and data, and cybersecurity is about protecting networks and programs from being damaged or compromised or attacked. And why do cyber attackers carry out cyber attacks? There are many reasons. Sometimes it's for ethical purposes, financial gain, disruption, fame, corporate espionage. There's a whole host of reasons as to why. You've just got to hope it's not you or be best prepared. So there are a whole array of options available to cyber attackers to carry out a cyber attack, and the list is growing daily. You'll have seen new types of attacks coming out through the COVID pandemic. And here's a list on the slide about various different types. You'll be well aware of malicious software, phishing, ransomware, denial of service attacks and the like. But data theft is growing, and the impact of data theft is greater now than ever before, particularly because of GDPR and equivalent laws around the world. Why is good security important? Well, it's important because your staff, your customers, your suppliers, regulators, and people you deal with expect their information to be protected, and they have a right to have that information protected. If you stay in a hotel, Marriott Hotel, for example, you don't expect your data to be breached and to be sold on the dark web. So people have an expectation their data will be protected. GDPR, for example, and the big fines that are now applicable to GDPR, again, emphasize the fact that personal data has to be protected. Cybercrime is increasing and continues to increase exponentially, and to prevent the impact on your business. So data theft, financial liabilities, profit share issues, share price, reputation. The reputational damage if you have a big data theft or cyber attack is probably never recoverable. There are lots of companies, BA, for example, Equifax, Marriott Group, who've been impacted significantly by the cyber attacks. So how do you protect your business from cybercrime? Well, one of the key aspects is making sure you have good security practices in place, and that includes your policies. So you're going to have to put in place, if you don't have already, proper cybersecurity policies and business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Quite often people, if they're outsourcing their software implementation, will pass this on to their third-party suppliers, and they won't really test or scrutinize these plans. And, you know, I work on lots of different software outsourcing projects. What I'd say to you is quite often it's left for a post-contract deliverable. So it's not seen as a key aspect of the transaction so much. So quite often it gets left to the last minute or not reviewed properly. And I think that's a bad idea, because companies not focusing enough on what they actually should be focusing on. So if you do outsource, then please look very carefully at what those plans say. And if you are relying on a third-party supplier, make sure that you test those plans, make sure that they're deliverable, they're credible, and they're measurable. If you don't, it's at your risk. There are other policies and procedures that you need to have in place in your business, and that includes things like data retention policies, your impact assessments for data protection, encryption and key management policies, and your data backup stuff. So all of that's still got to be in place. But what we're really focusing on today is cybersecurity and business continuity policies. So if we turn to your cybersecurity policies, they basically set out your defense strategy for cybersecurity and the standards of behavior that you expect in your business. So things like, do you require your staff to encrypt their email attachments? And what actually is important in terms of protecting assets in your business? How do you protect them? What are the threats? What are the weaknesses or entry points to your systems that could expose you to risk? And what security measures do you have in place? They're all vital. So your policy can help your business, help your employees and your staff to manage and maintain security risk and to maintain safety of data. So what information should you have in your policy? Well, there's a few things coming up on the slide now, but it needs to set out clearly who the policy applies to. So does it apply to your subcontractors as well? If it does, then you need to make sure that they're on notice of it and they know to comply with it. And if they don't comply with it, you hold them to account. It needs to say which controls your organization has implemented and the threats you've addressed. So for example, do you have antivirus software and firewalls in place? What are your password requirements? Do you actually force staff to implement new passwords? Are they secure passwords? What do you do with email attachments? You know, what's your policy with email attachments? How do you back up your data? What's your policy in terms of on-prem and cloud data storage? And how should your staff handle sensitive data? Should they be holding it, for example, in their Outlook account, or should they be holding it more securely? It also should set out how you implement new technology. So if, for example, you are bringing in a new piece of technology and you're taking out legacy systems, what's going to happen around handling that implementation? So who's going to handle the implementation? What are the risk points and risk factors, and how will it be delivered? It might require you to carry impact assessments, for example, in advance of actual implementation, because in my experience, it's very rare for implementations actually to be delivered exactly as you plan them to, particularly if you've got lots of legacy systems. You know, if you're integrating or getting rid of 19 separate legacy systems and integrating to one Microsoft 365, for example, it's a huge process. So you need to make sure that you do that very safely and carefully in a measured way. It should set out as well what you do around social media and internet access. So how do you allow your staff to use those in the workplace? You bring your own device to work, all that sort of thing. Importantly, how to handle a cyber incident and who to report it to, with examples of what cyber incidents might be. And that could impact anybody in the business, from the receptionist through to the managing director. Anybody could be an entry point to your company. So make sure you train people properly and that they know what cyber risks are and what the attacks might be, because any person could be the person that is the vulnerability in your company. So if we turn then to business continuity and disaster recovery, it's a key aspect of managing cyber incidents, but there is a difference. And business continuity basically focuses on keeping your business operational during the disaster. So keeping it ticking over, notwithstanding the fact you may have lost access to your customer data, you may have lost access to your database, you may not be able to see your customer invoices, you may not be able to bill, you may not have access to your payment systems, etc. A lot of your systems and data systems could be down. Disaster recovery focuses on restoring data access and your IT infrastructure after a disaster. So business continuity is keeping your business going during the disaster, and disaster recovery is restoring your data and IT infrastructure afterwards. There are key things you need to make sure you put in place for best practice, and these can help prevent business interruption which can present a raft of issues for you in your organization. So what happens if your business is interrupted? What does that actually mean? How does it impact you? Well, what happens is you have a loss of productivity in work. You'll have a loss of business opportunity and market share potentially. You could lose workspace, data and assets. You could have failures within your supply chain. So quite often cyber attacks will be in the third or fourth level of your supply chain. They won't actually be at your prime level. So it could be failures within your supply chain. There could be contractual or regulatory breaches like data protection. You could be fined by the ICO. You could lose a lot of money, so lost revenue. You may have to pay a fine. So you may have to pay a fine to the ICO, but also you may have to pay a ransom to malware attackers. And you could also have very serious damage to reputation. So there are lots of things that you need to do to make sure that you don't get implemented by that. So for listed companies, you have to have business continuity. It's an absolute contractual requirement, but for non-listed companies, it's just a prudent measure really, just to make sure that you're properly prepared and you know how you would make the business survive if certain of your systems are down or inaccessible for whatever reason. The benefit to you is if you have a business continuity policy, you should have focus, control and order in the event of a crisis. So if one of your systems does become inaccessible or you are subject to a cyber attack, you can still keep the business running or peripherally running, notwithstanding that. Obviously, you should do your risk assessments and carry those out to work out what the key factors are and where the big risks are for you in your industry, because they will differ. They're not the same for every business and they always differ. So, you know, pulling a business continuity plan from one business and applying it across to another is not a sensible thing to do because it probably won't be applicable to you at all. And what should you focus on? Well, how long do you think your business can actually last without your IT infrastructure, your assets? And what's critical to your operations? Possible outcomes if you're denied access to those facilities or infrastructure. And how long do you think you can operate without telephone, without electricity, or without water or other utilities? What changes might you need to make to processes and workflows to maintain your critical operations until the situation can be returned to normal? Because you may need to think about those things in advance. There are also scenarios which are most likely to occur, which would create the greatest disruption to your organization. Plan those in advance. So know what the biggest risks are to your business and focus on those biggest risks and mitigating those biggest risks. Because if you can take steps to mitigate those biggest risks and have a plan B, it will always put you in a much stronger position if and when you identify that you are at risk. A disaster recovery plan has many of the same elements as a business continuity plan, but there are certain things that are different. So, for example, things like your communication processes, your impact assessments, your backup plan, your response and communication plan. But communication of these policies and plans is absolutely vital. So there's no point having them sat in a drawer or on your intranet unless people know them. They have to be living, breathing documents. It's absolutely critical. So lots of organizations fail to communicate these policies and plans to their staff properly, and they fail to carry out adequate training and tests on the policies and the plans. And that is a disaster scenario for you and your business when you need to implement them. It's absolutely vital that people know what it's for, when it's to be used and where it's located. It shouldn't just be a plan on paper. You must train people in actual implementation of that plan. And you must do tests. So whether you do that yourself or whether you outsource it to a third party, you have to make sure that that plan can actually be implemented and simulate scenarios. So you can do tabletop tests, tabletop exercises, or you can simulate scenarios yourself within the business. For example, our IT team quite regularly send emails around that are basically like malware attacks or phishing attacks. And they send them around just to see how the employees in the business react. And it's a continual process of learning, education, and just reminding people where the exposures will be, what factors to look for in the email, etc. So continual testing and continual monitoring is absolutely key. The other thing to bear in mind is emergency backup. So you might want to have a silver briefcase policy, for example. So quite a few businesses have an emergency backup. So they have certain documents and certain procedures and policies with business critical information at different locations. So for example, it could be a CEO or a managing director, and they would have a pack of documents which is passed to another person when they go on holiday or they're on leave or out of the business or abroad on holiday, whatever it may be. And what they do is then they pass that policy to the next responsible person. So there's always somebody in the business that holds all that business critical data. And that's things like your policies, your plans, your backups, key documents like insurance policies, your broker's phone number, your records, where equipment might be that you need in the event of an incident. So what do you need to restore your systems? How are you going to do it quickly? And that emergency backup can be retrieved in the event of a cyber incident by any person. So it's vital you have these sort of procedures in place. So what would my big recommendation be to you? Well, it would be, please don't be the person that phones us at 4:30 in the afternoon saying, I've got a problem. We've got an issue, we've got a cyber attack, we don't know what to do. We've been asked to pay £1 million in Bitcoin by a ransomware attacker. Please don't be that person. If you are, please be prepared. So whatever you do, take action today to make sure you have your proper policies and procedures in place. Make sure they're credible and they're achievable. Make sure they're updated regularly, and make sure your staff are properly trained to cope with a cyber attack. Also make sure you're insured, because that will help take a lot of the pain away if you are impacted, and get support and help externally if you need it. You may need specialist help in these situations, and hopefully you'll never have to. But if you do need to, then ask, and we'll help connect you with people that can help you deal with ransomware attackers and the like. But having your insurance in place is absolutely critical, because quite often the ransom for the ransomware attackers will be paid for by your insurers. So having that insurance in place is critical for you. And it does take some of the pain away, because you know you're not going to have to worry about paying the ransom, because your insurers will do it. You've just got to worry about getting your systems back up and running, and controlling the loss of data or systems which has happened to your business. There are a few tips that you can follow in terms of making sure that your policies and procedures actually work in your business. So what I would say is make sure that your staff are trained and they understand the key business risks. So where are the risks in your business? Where are the key entry points? And what can each employee do to make sure that that business risk is minimized? Every single person is a potential entry point to your business and a potential risk to your business. So make sure they're all adequately trained. And then in terms of your policies, obviously make sure they're created by the right people that have the right level knowledge and information to understand your business processes and systems, and who know how they work and operate intimately. But if you need external advice and you haven't been through something like this before, then take that external advice. But also make sure you do proper testing. You either do desktop exercises, you do penetration testing, you work with a cybersecurity company maybe to test your systems and see where the vulnerabilities might be and whether you need extra protections in place. You could have a cybersecurity audit, for example. You could look at ISO accreditation for cybersecurity. There's a number of different things you can do to make your business, to put your business in a much stronger position than just having a draft policy sat in a desk. So if you have policies in place, fantastic, thumbs up. That's a great step forwards. But do those policies actually work? Have you tested them? Have you implemented them? Have you asked your employees whether they know what those processes are? And if they do you know that they work? Are they updated? Have you changed your systems? Quite often documents might be out of date and they haven't been changed sufficiently, or they just haven't been tested. So make sure that they have. So scrutinize them, have an open and honest discussion with your internal customer, your employees and your advisors, and make sure that they actually work. because the last thing you need to do is just to have a draft policy that's not implementable when you really need it. And trust me, when you are subject to a cyber attack, that's not the time to be thinking about what you should be doing to recover your systems. You just need to be implementing, and you need to have a process and system where you know who's responsible for what, and who takes what action when. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour about policies and procedures and some of the issues that impact businesses in a cybersecurity situation, or when they're impacted by a cyber attack. If you have any more questions, then please do not hesitate to get in contact. I will be on some of the sessions over the course of the next few days. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have, or to have a chat with anybody independently. Just email me anytime. Thank you very much for bearing with me. I know it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but hopefully I've scared you enough to know that you need to get these policies in place and make them living, breathing, real documents in your business. Don't make them the policies that I see often, which are literally just resigned to a desk and never used or implemented on a day-to-day basis. They're not tested, the businesses are not protected adequately. So don't make that your business. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of the Harrison Clark Rickaby Cybersecurity Conference, and goodbye.
Hello and welcome to the live Q&A session following Nicola's talk there, the good, the bad, the ugly, getting your policies and contracts right. And you can see that I'm joined by Nicola, who's just been speaking. Nicola, thank you for joining us. Nicola is head of the technology sector at Harrison Clark Rickaby's and one of my fellow partners in the commercial team. Delighted that Nicola can join us for this afternoon's Q&A over the course of the next half an hour or so. So Nicola, lots of questions in before the presentation just now, and also some live questions coming in over the platform as well. First question really is a question that came in beforehand, but also links into one of the questions that have come in over the platform, and that is, why do some businesses not take cybersecurity seriously? What do you think they're missing?
Do you know, I think it's interesting because cybersecurity is the biggest threat to businesses nowadays, whether you're an SME or a large corporate or public sector organisation and so on. So I really can't understand or fathom why it's not top of the agenda. It's not an agenda item on most boardroom agendas, and it's also not something that CEOs tend to focus on. So I think they pass the buck a little to the CTO or the CIO in their business, and they don't actually get to grips with it, which I think is a great pity, because it is absolutely business critical. And without getting that element right, then you really are exposing your business to very significant risk and potential risk of business failure. I think it's that, you can look at any sort of analogy, but I think it's the same in our jobs. We find sometimes people are reluctant to think about their wills and life insurance and all that sort of thing, because they think, oh, well, I'm never going to need it, so it won't happen to us, it'll happen to somebody else. I'm not going to get run over by a bus, my company won't be subject to a cybersecurity attack. We don't need to take the cost and expense and effort of going to putting proper policies in place, testing them, doing penetration testing, and getting consultancy and advisory help to make it happen. We'll just take a risk. I genuinely think that is the point, and until it becomes a regular agenda item for boards and board directors hold each other accountable to this, I don't think it will be top of the agenda, but it very much should be.
I think that's a really interesting point, Nicola, about distinguishing the executive and the non-executive when it comes to the board, and where those responsibilities lie and where the ultimate responsibilities lie. There's a strong argument in corporate governance, of course, that the non-exec should bear a lot more responsibility. If you're a non-exec, what do you think should be the standout reason for you arguing that cybersecurity should be far more important than perhaps it is? We've got a number of non-execs attending this afternoon.
It's a really interesting question, Robert, because The responsibilities of a non-exec director are exactly the same as an executive director. You have exactly the same standards and obligations in law, so you can't abdicate your responsibilities and say, oh well, that's the responsibility of the CTO or the CIO. I'm not going to probe them or question them on that issue. I'll just take their report issued to board as read and approved, and I won't scrutinise it, because unfortunately the law holds you accountable regardless. Obviously, if you have a special qualification, so if you have an IT qualification, or you have a history or experience in cybersecurity, then your standard might actually be over and above that of the executive director. So I think any non-exec director sitting on a board needs to think very, very carefully about the potential risk factors. And if it's not an item on the agenda, you need to think very carefully about why it's not, and perhaps raise that with the exec and hold them accountable.
It almost warrants being a regular agenda item, doesn't it? Not every meeting, but certainly on a regular, recurring basis, to make sure the issue gets picked up and dealt with, and is then constantly being updated. Because once you've done it once, that isn't the end of it, is it?
No, exactly. I would say at least quarterly, and then obviously for your annual accounts, because you should be doing a review from a data protection perspective and looking at data protection impact assessments and the like as well. So I think in the whole, it should be one of your risk register issues and looked at quarterly.
Good, thank you. So moving on slightly, invariably in this day and age, cybersecurity and business continuity have become interlinked. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because cybersecurity now is so business critical to every business. So there's very few businesses that operate without IT infrastructure. So the cybersecurity element of that, and the move of a lot of crime into cybercrime, inevitably means that most businesses can't continue to operate unless they have proper cybersecurity plans that are implementable. So that's why I think they're inextricably linked now, because there are not many businesses that can operate without having proper IT infrastructure. And that means holding data, that means processing that data, that means maintaining IT systems and security of those systems. So I think, we're in a very different marketplace now to where we were 20 years ago. So now they're just going to get closer and closer, in my view.
Okay. Do you want to give us some examples, Nicola, of what your clients have faced by way of cybersecurity threats? You obviously deal with a lot of clients day in, day out over a range of sectors and indeed a range of geography. What are some of the main examples that you're seeing that people should perhaps be aware of?
So very varied, I would say. So some clients are some people that we advise are very sophisticated users of technology that can be duped by fraudsters. So, for example, website hacking, purchasing assets through online trading platforms that turn out to be not the assets that you thought that you were buying. We've had incidents of people thinking that they're buying cryptocurrencies online, but they're not actually buying cryptocurrencies at all. They're buying CFDs, or contracts for differences, which is basically a bet between whether one asset is worth more than the other, that you don't own any underlying asset. And there's a lot of criminality that sits behind that, unfortunately. So quite a few people are duped by that sort of fraud. And in terms of corporates, I guess it would be ransomware attacks, really. Ransomware attacks are one of the obvious ways that businesses are threatened, and their systems can be impacted quite easily with fairly sizable costs to the business. So we've had a number of people who've been impacted by ransomware attacks. But yeah, very varied, actually, a real mixture. And we've seen a real growth over the last 18 months to 2 years during the pandemic. So cybercrime has increased 300% during that period, which is quite astounding, really.
Picking up on your comment just now about cybercrime increasing by 300% during the pandemic, do you think there's any link between that increase and the amount of people who are now working from home?
So that's a really interesting question, because I think cyber criminals will always attach themselves to something that forms part of our daily lives and our daily routine. So there's been a marked increase in terms of fraud relating to home deliveries. So home delivery services like Royal Mail, UBS, Hermes, etc. So people getting texts to their mobile phone or calls or emails saying you have an unpaid fine, or there's cost to pay. Please call us or please text us, taking the bank account details and then emptying their bank account. So that has been quite prolific during the pandemic, because most people have had an Amazon delivery driver coming and delivering something daily or pretty regularly during the pandemic. So people have capitalized on that. And I think cyber criminals will always capitalize on something, particularly when it forms part of your daily life and you're distracted and you're too busy. So I think quite often it comes down to finding new ways of tackling cybercrime, because cyber criminals will always catch on to something. I do think there's been a rise in cybercrime during the pandemic because of the home working situation, partly because there hasn't really been a divide between home and work, partly because people have been working flexibly. So you might be working on your mobile device, for example, that may not have the same security as your laptop, whilst working remotely out of the office, and you could quite easily compromise your systems by accepting some malware through an email or opening an attachment that you shouldn't open, and that could compromise all of your systems for your company as a whole. So I do think that the pandemic has been part of that, but I also think that cyber criminals, particularly organised crime, so this is global organised crime, have moved very much now onto online criminality. So, 10, 15 years ago, you might have been more worried about carjacking. Now you should be more concerned about theft of data and people clearing out your client bank accounts. That's much more likely to occur now than your standard people burgling your house or stealing a car or burgling your business. The data's worth far more.
I think it's interesting how the cyber criminals have taken advantage of the pandemic to morph into a new area, and have taken advantage of people being outside their normal their previous normals of how they were working to take advantage. Nicola, you haven't touched on the kind of the magnitude of the ransoms assault or the payments that are made. I'm sure our attendees were probably quite interested to hear what you're seeing in that regard.
Sure. So the average ransomware fine is about, or the ransomware paid is about £250,000. So it's quite significant. That's not every ransomware attack. So I would say they range between 5 figures and 7 figures, depending on the severity and the amount of data and the size of the organization which has been hacked, really.
And how are those payments being made, Nicola?
Well, the majority of them are actually covered by cyber insurance, so 94% are paid by cyber insurance. But interestingly, of the organizations that believe they're insured, so 84% of businesses believe they're insured for a ransomware attack, but the insurers only pay in 64% of cases. So actually, from the people who think they're insured for a cybersecurity attack, only 4 in 5 are covered. So 1 in 5 is not. So the board will be comforted by the fact that they have cybersecurity insurance, but have they actually checked the coverage? Will it cover the fine? Because quite often these policies won't. So you do have to check the detail, I'm afraid.
I suppose that's probably quite an important takeaway from anybody attending today, isn't it? To actually to make sure they go back and check if they have got cybersecurity. It actually covers them for everything they think they've got covered. And if they haven't got cybersecurity, to probably try and put it in place. And is cybersecurity insurance easy enough to put in place, Nicola? Or are there any particular things for people to look out at?
So you should go to a specialist broker. So we have Simon de Boulay from Lime Street Brokers, who is participating in the sessions over the next few days. So he's doing a session on cyber insurance. So please come along and listen to that session and find out a bit more about how they price these policies, how they broker them, what they cover, what they don't cover, all policy wording, all that sort of stuff. So he'll go into much more detail on all of that. But what I would say is that cybersecurity used to be just an add-on to your normal PI policy, but now, particularly if you want to work in financial services, so if you want to become an electronic money provider, or you want to operate on the open banking system, you have to have a separate designated cybersecurity policy. So there are regulatory requirements now for having cybersecurity cover, particularly for these businesses operating in the new financial services or fintech market. So it may not be a consideration that you actually decide yourself. It may be an obligation, but yes, these policies can be obtained, but you need to go to a specialist broker, because not every insurance broker will be able to place this kind of policy for you.
And how is it? In what form are the ransoms paid, Nicola? Are they paid Bitcoin, cryptocurrency?
Yeah, so they're normally paid in Bitcoin, which always amazes me, because the whole point of Bitcoin blockchain technology, which underlines Bitcoin or any sort of cryptocurrency, is that it's all completely traceable. So unless you go to use Zcash or Monero or one of these forms of cryptocurrency that aren't traceable, it is traceable. But I think it's because what the criminals will do is they'll just split that money really quickly and then layer it as you would with traditional money laundering. And they'll probably use technical measures to hide it. So there are tools you can use, like mixing, which basically splits the Bitcoin into millions of different pieces and then reconstructs them with other assets. So it's really, really difficult then to piece together all the pieces of the jigsaw. But the National Crime Agency are following people who are paid out ransomware attacks, and they do follow the criminality as far as they need to take it. So that's not that's public domain information. Of course, they're following that criminal money because it's part of global police services. But if I was going to be paid a fine, or if I was going to be paying a fine or a ransom, I wouldn't particularly want it to be in something that's traceable. I question whether that's the right way to be paid, but they do normally want to be paid in Bitcoin, sometimes Ethereum, which is a different type of crypto, but it's normally Bitcoin ransom.
As you say, it's odd that they want to be paid in something which is traceable. It doesn't seem a very sensible thing from their perspective, but as is not to question why. We don't think as those people do. Okay, fine. We've talked about some of the examples. We've talked about some of the ransoms that are claimed. Turning then to looking at the actual factors that give rise to a cyber breach, what do you think are the main risk factors for people to look out for in their own businesses? What would you say are the main red flags for them?
So 95% of cybercrime is caused by human error, which is a very stark statistic. So what I would say is the main route into your business by cyber criminals is through your people. It's through your staff. So if you can get to a position where your staff are very well trained, know where the vulnerabilities are in your business, know where the risk factors are, they know how to identify malware, phishing attacks, etc., and they are your firewall. They are your virtual firewall. So I think the big risk really is your employees. I think the other risk then is we had a session this morning by FDI Consulting about your internal threat, and that's when you have rogue staff. So when you fall out with an employee who then goes and posts all of your employee data, bank accounts, names, addresses, national insurance numbers online in the dark web. People do that. You have employees who are disgruntled because they haven't been paid overtime. Will go out and do something like that in a spiteful fit of rage. So things like that do happen, but there are tools now. So there are methods where you can use automated systems to track employee behavior and to monitor that employee behavior and to try and preempt these things from happening. So I think the employees are really the gate in and out. So managing that relationship really carefully and tracking in accordance with the law, because you have to be careful in tracking employees. You have to notify them if you're going to track their activities on company systems, and trying to intercept anything that happens that shouldn't be happening is really business critical.
Yeah, it was an interesting session this morning. In fact, I had the pleasure to chair that session, and some really interesting points there about your biggest internal risks being staff and former staff, and to a degree human error, but also deliberate actions.
Absolutely.
So you make a fair comment there. But of course, you've got the dichotomy on the one hand between wanting to check again your staff, because on the other side, not being overly scrutinising them for fear of breach of their privacy and human rights. So there's a real tension there for people to take away and work through in their own business. So definitely a session worth watching if people this afternoon have got a particular interest in internal breaches. So you've touched there on some of the steps which people can take to be proactive. Are there any particular courses you would recommend, or any particular accreditations that businesses can avail themselves of to try and protect them?
So you can look at ISO accreditations, so that information security accreditations like ISO 27001, quite often that's needed for public sector tendering and the like anyway, but it takes you part way on the journey. So it's good to have these accreditations, notwithstanding whether you require them for public tendering purposes or otherwise. But in terms of courses, I guess I would say that I would say work with a cybersecurity consultancy that has this kind of experience and that can maybe do an audit for you, maybe can run some penetration testing. You could work with ethical hackers, get someone just to actually look at your system, see where the vulnerabilities are, and just shake things up a little bit for you. There's no harm in doing that. But in terms of courses, of course, there are courses at universities and further education colleges and the like for CTOs or aspiring CTOs who might need extra expertise in this area, because I guess lots of people have been in business for many, many years, and this is an evolving space. So they may have been working 20, 30 years in industry and not have had specific cybersecurity training. So that's always something to consider. So upskilling, no matter what your age or stage of career, is always a good thing.
Okay. So we've touched on the overarching kind of situation and backdrop, but how common are cyber security breaches and attacks, Nicola? How often are clients experiencing them?
Well, the point here is that reported cybersecurity attacks are increasing manifestly. So we know the reported ones are increasing significantly, but there are a lot that just aren't ever publicized. And the reason they're not publicized is because businesses don't want damage to their name, goodwill, and reputation. I mentioned during my talk earlier that Uber were hacked in 2016 and 57 million people's details were stolen, and they concealed that for over a year, and they tried to pay off the hackers to delete the stolen data to keep the breach quiet. So they tried to brush it under the carpet. So I think there is a lot of that. I think people are ashamed and they think we shouldn't have been subject to a cyber attack, so we're not going to publicize it. Some people don't want to report it to the police. If they haven't got insurance cover, they just try and deal with it themselves. So I think a lot of it goes unreported, in all honesty. So will we ever know the scale of it? I don't think. But certainly the reported figures have increased 300% in the last 18 months.
Right, interesting. And let's talk about ethical hackers. Nicola, what's your perspective on them?
Well, it's interesting. My 6-year-old boy. So my 6-year-old little boy wants to be an ethical hacker. So I've had to have some interesting conversations with him about it. But ethical hackers have a purpose and they have a drive. So what they try and do is identify vulnerabilities in people's IT systems. And normally what they'll do is they'll give you an opportunity to actually correct it. So they'll notify you and say, right, you've got 2 weeks to correct this defect or this fault or this vulnerability. And if you don't correct it, then they will hack your systems because they feel they have a moral obligation to do that. So there are lots of reasons why ethical hackers do what they do. You know, we have some participating in the conference over the next few days, and there is purpose behind what they actually do. People are motivated by different things, aren't they? And there is a place for ethical hackers without a doubt, because they do push forward businesses to be more compliant, and they're not doing it for personal gain. You know, there's a difference between being a bounty hunter where you are actually taking ransom payments and being an ethical hacker that will get a ransom paid and then will return the ransom less the transaction fee. So they're just making a point. And why not if you've got the skill and capability to do it or not? But yeah, ethical hackers is a growing thing. So, you know, I don't think 10 years ago people even knew what an ethical hacker was, but it's becoming much more and more common.
I don't think 10 years ago people were even really conscious of cybersecurity, weren't they? And look at how that whole space has evolved in the last 10 years. Nicola, you've covered lots of really interesting material in both your presentation and also the Q&A. For those of the attendees that have seen and heard me chair events like this before, I always like to finish up with one wrap question, which is something along the lines normally of, what would be the 3 key takeaways that attendees should have today, so that when they go back to their desks this afternoon or tomorrow morning, there are 3 action points that they carry forward over the days, weeks and months ahead? What would be your 3 from today?
So the first thing I would say is be proactive and be reactive. So look really carefully at your systems and processes and really scrutinize them, see what's working and what's not working. If you need to get external help to do that, then do that. But you can use automated tools to actually help identify risks and vulnerabilities. So be proactive in terms of implementing a cybersecurity strategy. Once you've got that strategy in place, then please test it, make sure it works. There's nothing worse than having an IT outage or failure and finding that your 2 backup servers haven't worked or your systems have been hacked because you just didn't have adequate measures in place. And then train people. So communicate. Just make sure your staff know the risks and vulnerabilities. Train, continually train. You can't overtrain people on this stuff. If 95% of attacks are through human error and vulnerability, if you train your people, you're going to massively reduce your exposure.
Thanks, Nicola. I think it's quite interesting. We had some very similar themes in the 3 takeaways from this morning's session. I think yours around having a plan, road testing it, really hitting the road and testing the rubber, and then actually communication is absolutely paramount. I think a couple of comments I'd add on top of that, a couple of extras before we move over to the chat room, would be obviously check you've got insurance, and if you have got insurance, make sure it covers you for everything you think you've got covered. If you haven't got insurance, go out and get it. And I think probably the other thing is, don't be surprised, amazed, shocked, upset, disappointed, embarrassed if you do have a cybersecurity breach. If you do, pick up the phone to your advisors and take the advice and deal with it in the same way you deal with an employment issue or a health and safety issue or any other issue that you face in your business. I think part of the comms, Nicola, isn't just internally, is it? It's actually clients taking that advice externally, but are fearful, embarrassed, upset, disappointed, and feel concerned. So some great takeaways there. We've still got another 5 minutes or so left before the session finishes. So we'll go now over to the chat room and see what further questions we have there. So thank you for your time, Nicola.
Thank you, Robert.